Hi, I'm Dave Lamacraft. I work for Plant Life as their plants champion. So I basically lead on our work on lichens and bryophytes and occasionally a little bit of fungi across England and Wales and occasionally a little bit of Scotland. I'm going to talk to you this morning about lichens on ancient trees. So to start with, it's just worth saying that lichens don't just grow randomly. They have specific requirements and they're found in communities. So I guess just like we tend to form communities of like-minded individuals, whether it's water skiers or lichenologists, lichens do much the same. Um, and although ancient trees have a number of communities associated with various kind of niches and ages and things on those trees, the UK supports the bulk of the world population of a community of lichens that likes the dry, rain-sheltered bark of ancient oak trees in particular. So what influences what lichens grow where? So at a big scale, we have things like habitat availability. So, you're not going to get Atlantic oakwood species in sandy heathland in the Brecks, for example. I mean, a number of species are actually they will jump habitats, but by and large, lichens are determined by the availability of different habitats. Climate's pretty significant. So again, you get your Western Atlantic sort of rainforest species in the warm, mild climates, and you'll get, which you won't get those species that are found in the northwest Scottish rainforest in southern England, beechwoods, for example. So climate's pretty important, and a lot of the species we're dealing with through the project are basically sub-oceanic species. So they're kind of found in not quite in the far west, but just a little bit west, so down through the eastern lakes, down through the Welsh marshes, and across southern England. And air quality has been a major driver in lichen distributions for the past couple of hundred years. We have things like sulfur dioxide pollution, the map on the left here, which has basically wiped out loads of sensitive lichen species from much of England since the Industrial Revolution. So species like the lungwort lichens, for example. Thankfully, that's declining now, but it is being replaced somewhat by nitrogen. And the kind of nitrogen issue you hear talked about quite a bit, but it's not one issue, it's two. It's ammonia on the one hand, and it's nitrous oxide on the other, and it's ammonia that's particularly damaging for lichens. And this is mostly agriculturally derived. Seems to be a strong link, particularly to dairy farming. And this basically will change the composition of lichen communities by favouring the species that are more tolerant of nutrients versus those that can't handle excess nutrients. Then at a finer scale, obviously within a wood you have different areas that have different microclimates and things like that. But the different trees, the way the trees grow, it's all pretty important stuff. So we have things like bark chemistry. So at the very acidic end of the spectrum, you have things like birch trees and alder trees. So lichens that are tolerant of or are able to cope with those more acidic conditions will grow on those trees. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the base-rich bark species. So have things like elm trees. Ash is somewhere not quite as base-rich as elm. Field maple is pretty base-rich, and then in the middle we have things like oak trees, and oak trees will actually change their bark chemistry as they age. They start off relatively acidic, but they become more base-rich. Light is really important. A lot of species are light demanding. It does vary, but you get different niches suitable for different species according to the light levels. Similarly with moisture, so some species like this community I keep talking about, the one of ancient dry bark, so those species avoid anywhere with sort of direct wetting from rain or any runs of moisture down the trunks. They get their moisture from dew, essentially. Then we have things like nutrient availability, so whether that's from ammonia, artificial sources, or from, for example, rot holes, wound tracks. And influencing all of those things, we have tree architecture, really. And this tree on the right here is a good example of just how many niches can be provided, how much habitat for lichens can be provided by a tree, depending on how it grows. So you obviously have a lot of surface area here of trunk, branches, twigs. You have different aspects, different moisture levels, different light levels. And this is that ancient dry bark community on the rain sheltered, very dry, but well lit, importantly, well lit, ancient oak trunks. So just to look at some of the species we've been working on, this is Caloplaca herbidella, the geranium fire dot. And this likes well lit, less acidic oak trunks. It gets called the mature mesic bark community, and it especially likes veteran oak. This is one of its classic sites in England, Savernake Forest in Wiltshire. But sadly, this is the only area where it's still found at this site. It's only on 2 trees here now, because it likes these well lit conditions, and that's the only bit of the forest that's remained well lit. These fantastic specimens of open grown oak. The rest of the forest has been planted up basically as an oak plantation in about the 1940s. So there's a lot of lichen interest there, has suffered from the shading of that. This is its distribution. You can see through the Welsh Marches and into the New Forest area. We have added a dot on the map up in Cumbria. And this is Lecanora sublevescens, the lemon tart lichen. You'll see from this photo it doesn't look like particularly appetizing lemon tarts, but slightly mouldy ones perhaps in this photo anyway. This is another species that likes those same conditions really as the Caloplaca, the well-lit trunks of mature oak trees. Less acidic generally, but slightly more tolerant of more acidic bark than the Caloplaca. And again, this is Savernake Forest. This tree here has both Lecanora sublevescens and Caloplaca herbidella. And it's a classic example really of a well-lit trunk, open-growing tree. And again, that sub-oceanic distribution through the marches and across southern England. We've added a dot up in Yorkshire, just to buck the trend, and also recently found it at Knepp. And this is the saproof lichen, Basidia incompta, which is a wound track species. A former elm specialist, likes trees with the more basic bark, elm, field maple, ash, horse chestnut. Ash is a particularly important species for it, sadly, but on some sites like Moccas, field maple and horse chestnut are really important. And you can see this is classic habitat for it really. This horse chestnut has lost a limb, it's got a rot hole which fills the water runs down the trunk. This green stripe here is entirely Basidia incompta. Slightly wider distribution, but many of those dots are pre-2000 dots. It does seem to have declined quite significantly in the last 20 years. And then this is one of the pinhead species. So this is one of those species that forms the dry bark community. A real elm specialist, now seems to be lost from its last English sites. We surveyed it through the project but failed to find it. So its only UK site now is up in Scotland, not far from Loch Ness. And this is one of the pox lichens, perennial nitida, which is a southern beech specialist, which likes rain tracks on veteran beech trees. So it kind of needs that flushing down the trunks. This is classic habitat for it at Burnham Beeches. Slightly less of a sub-oceanic thing, but more of a southern beech thing. You see it basically occupies, apart from that Pembrokeshire dot, basically occupies the kind of native beech forest range in the UK. So what do these lichens require? Well, the key thing really is continuity of conditions. So This picture here on the left is from an engraving, Victorian era engraving of Burnham Beeches. Picture on the right is one that I took a couple of years ago at the beaches. Not intentionally, but they seem to match quite nicely. It's quite by chance. But you can see the kind of conditions, the existence of the trees themselves and the conditions around the trees, that open, well lit nature, has persisted for at least 150 years in this instance. It's also interesting in this engraving that you've got these amazing big old things, pollards. That one looks like it's been relatively recently pollarded. This one looks like it's pollarded quite a while ago. Then there's younger trees here in the middle, so you kind of get a hint of that succession of generations of management, but maintaining those conditions throughout. And much of this is really about managing light and shade. So most of these species are light demanding. So a lot of this is about managing regeneration. And grazing and browsing is the best way to manage this long term. Both of these photos are of Savanac forest. The one on the left is a tree that supports Basidium compta, actually on an oak, which doesn't normally happen. But this oak is obviously quite a base-rich oak, because it also supports one of our other target species called Calema fragrans, the fragrant jelly lichen. And this is the oak plantation around it, which I mentioned. And that was basically shading out the tree, putting pressures on the tree itself, but also creating shade for the lichens. So that's been thinned and haloed basically to remove the impact on the tree itself and also on the lichens. And then recently grazing has been reinstated in Savanac, in parts of Savanac forest, through a stewardship agreement, not to do with the project, our project, but through the work of Natural England and the site owners and managers. So that's a good example really of kind of having to do mechanical interventions to address a shade issue and then getting that long-term sustainable management in the form of grazing in this case. So ivy can be a particular problem, especially when it's this younger stuff that just kind of creeps up the trunks, as you can see on the picture on the left here. Now, the picture on the right, the grey-brown crust in the centre of the photo is a lichen called the brown shingle lichen, Fuscopinaria sampliana. It's only known on 2 trees in England, and this is one of them. And the ivy here is growing directly over the lichen itself. It's spreading up the trunk. Obviously, it will cause shade as well as directly overgrowing the lichen. So give it a few years and that lichen will be gone, essentially. So ivy can be a tricky one in that it is clearly important for a load of other wildlife, bats, for example. Now, bat-wise, it tends to be the thicker trunked ivy, the more mature ivy, kind of crown ivy that forms those thick trunks that provides roost sites between the ivy trunk and the tree trunk. Ivy is also a really important late season nectar source for a whole range of invertebrates. Having said that, it is increasing and it is a major threat to a lot of our epiphytic lichens and bryophytes and ferns, and it does need controlling in many situations. The general rule of thumb we've ended up working to is to not bother with any of the mature crown ivy, but to focus more on this younger stuff that's invading tree trunks, and it seems to be becoming an increasing problem that wasn't there so much in the past. I think perhaps changes in management of woodlands and trees is playing into that, whether it's grazing or browsing or simply cutting ivy. I think there's also some links to nitrogen or ammonia deposition. But whatever the reason, it is an issue and it does need some control. And I think, like I say, the rule of thumb we're working to is to focus on the stuff like in this picture here, especially when it's threatening rare lichens or potentially good habitat. And things like replacement trees, that's pretty important, especially on many of our sort of more parklandy sites where we're getting these big generation gaps. So that can either be done through selecting it through natural regeneration, such as this is Savanac again on the left. These group of younger trees has been allowed to survive and or not cut down basically, and they'll form future generations of ancient trees. And then at other sites we've been planting trees like this horse chestnut at Moccas in Herefordshire. We have things like Veteranisation. So this is a lovely old field maple again at Savanac. So this has Basidia incompta along with some other rare species like Guylecta flotowii. Beautiful old thing. So we've been doing some work on some younger field maples to basically pollard them and create sort of veteran features, create rot holes and things like that in them. Again, this has been at Savanac. And then we have things like translocation, which, it's a tricky one, translocation, because it can seem like an easy win. It's generally not as easy as it might seem, but even then it's no substitute for actually managing sites to encourage the lichens to move about naturally. Through the project we have trialled for the first time the transplanting of crustose species. So these are the species that kind of grow immersed in the bark. So this is an example of perennial nitida transplanted at Burnham Beeches. So large diameter deadwood can be a really important lichen habitat in parklands, wood pastures, any woodlands really. Crucial things with it though are it has to be dry and well lit, so shaded, damp. Deadwood tends to become dominated more by bryophytes. So it's this kind of sunny, dry, large diameter deadwood that is particularly important. Stuff like you see in this photo on the right here, which is Moccas Park. This large limb has fallen and it's basically been left where it fell. So that's pretty important. You can see the photo on the left. There's some big old chunks of deadwood left there on the ground, but there's also a pile of deadwood against the trunk on the left there. And this is pretty bad practice really in terms of lichen interest at least. It basically takes up the niches available to the lichens on those lower trunks, and it's the lower trunks, especially actually as in this case where it's slightly shaded, it's on the overhung bit as the trunk leans. So that's a particularly important niche for the ancient drybark community and a range of other species. So pretty bad practice generally lichen wise to pile the cut stuff against the trunk. It's much better off being left exactly as it fell, and that tends to be the case for the invertebrates too in actual fact. So there we go. Hope that was interesting. Thank you very much for listening.